Gaslighting, the distortion of reality. Tonight we won't seek peace. We will seek clarity in the shadows where peace usually hides. True rest doesn't come from ignoring the psychological noise, but from understanding the subtle whispers of control that shape our relationships and decisions. This is psychological reconnaissance, designed to illuminate the dark patterns of human behavior that thrive in complexity and confusion. As your muscles settle and the day's weight slides away, your mind remains open, receptive, learning the hidden scripts that govern influence, the silent levers pulled beneath the surface of everyday interactions. We are going deep into the mechanisms of manipulation most people only experience as a vague anxiety. What if the most damaging forms of psychological control aren't loud demands or obvious threats, but quiet structural alterations to the ground you stand on? Do you truly know when your reality is being rewritten by someone else, or when your internal compass is being deliberately magnetized to point the wrong way? This journey begins with the most insidious structural weapon in the manipulator's arsenal: gaslighting, the distortion of reality. Have you ever felt completely certain of something, a conversation, an event, a commitment, only to have that certainty dissolve entirely under the pressure of another person's absolute, unwavering denial? It is a chilling, disorienting sensation, the slow dawning realization that the internal architecture of your memories might be fundamentally faulty. Gaslighting is not merely lying. It is a calculated, sustained campaign designed to make you question your memory, your perception, and ultimately, your sanity. The term originates from a 1938 stage play and a subsequent 1944 film, where a husband systematically dimmed the gaslights in their home, then vehemently insisted the wife was hallucinating the change. The point was never the lights themselves, but forcing her to doubt her own senses, thereby making her fully reliant on his authority. It is the architectural vandalism of the mind. Imagine your mind as a vast, meticulous library, cataloging every experience, every promise, every hurt. Gaslighting is the process of sneaking into that library and, instead of erasing the books, subtly changing the spine labels, altering the dates, or moving entire sections to create deliberate chaos. When you go to pull out the book titled "The Argument We Had Last Tuesday," the manipulator insists the label actually reads "The Delusion You Created Last Month." The first tactic is always denial, often delivered with an air of absolute authority and pity. "I never said that. You must be misremembering," or the classic dismissal, "You're making things up again." The mechanism leverages trust and emotional dependency. Manipulators don't start with grand distortions. They begin with tiny fractures in your perception, planting seeds of doubt about minor details. When the victim, craving coherence, tries to argue the facts, the gaslighter shifts the focus instantly from the action to the victim's reaction. You attempt to articulate genuine hurt, and the reply is not accountability, but judgment. "Why are you always so dramatic?" Or, "You know I was just joking, right? You need professional help dealing with your insecurity." This maneuver shifts the entire conversation from their failure to your psychological flaw. Suddenly, you are defending your sanity instead of addressing their transgression. The paradox of gaslighting lies in the victim's response. You are often driven to seek reassurance and validation from the very source of the instability. The human mind craves stability and coherence above all else. When your internal memory conflicts violently with the external reality presented by a trusted figure, the mind often chooses to sacrifice the internal memory to preserve the relationship or the illusion of stability within that relationship. You begin to accept their version, not because it feels true, but because the cognitive dissonance of fighting the constant battle becomes too exhausting. You sacrifice reality for a momentary fragile peace. This phenomenon extends far beyond intimate relationships. We see it in toxic workplaces. The goals weren't unclear, you misunderstood the timeline. Or in public life, where documented, verifiable events are denied in real time, leaving large groups disoriented. The ultimate goal is to dismantle your epistemic confidence, your faith in what you know and how you know it. When you lose that deep primal faith in your own judgment, you become perpetually reliant on the gaslighter for validation and interpretation. You stop trusting your gut instinct, the ancestral warning system that signals danger. The victim enters a state of perpetual self-monitoring, constantly searching their own behavior for proof of their alleged instability. The world becomes muffled, uncertain, filtered solely through the manipulator's cynical lens. The environment is now designed to manufacture doubt. The remedy is simple, yet demanding. Anchor your reality. Keep internal records mentally or physically. Trust the echoes of your own consistent truth. Because the deepest manipulation is not making you believe a lie, but making you doubt that truth even exists. Listen closely now, because we move from denying reality to twisting the meaning of emotions themselves. Seeds of doubt, the engineering of self-sabotage, the anticipatory collapse. Do you ever feel a quiet, almost embarrassing sense of relief when the highly pressurized situation finally falls apart? That brief, strange moment when the crippling stress of potential failure gives way to the certainty of the actual realized outcome. You failed, yes, but at least the internal warfare is over. This relief is the gravitational core of what we call the anticipatory collapse. It is the sophisticated engineering of self-sabotage. This collapse is not merely procrastination or weakness. It is a calculated, often entirely unconscious defensive maneuver where you pre-engineer your own defeat to protect a specific, vulnerable aspect of your identity. The true psychological origin of chronic self-sabotage is not a lack of competence, but a fundamental strategy to manage shame and control. If you fail because you didn't try hard enough, your potential remains perfectly intact, safely insulated from external judgment. You control the narrative of failure, proving that the world did not reject you. You simply withdrew from the competition. Imagine the high-achieving student facing a final career-defining exam. The potential reward is immense, but the anxiety surrounding the effort required and the fear of an objective, measurable inadequacy is unbearable. Instead of studying relentlessly, they find an excuse. They engage in a high-stakes distraction. They create an unnecessary crisis, or they focus intensely on organizing their desk while ignoring the essential material. When the inevitable bad grade arrives, the internal monologue whispers the comforting lie. I didn't fail because I wasn't intelligent enough. I failed because I chose not to invest. The potential remains untouchable. The self-worth is protected, but the outcome is destroyed. The manipulator, the subtle puppeteer waiting for you to exhaust yourself, doesn't need to destroy your opportunities or directly attack your abilities. They only need to gently nudge you toward your own internal trigger points. They exploit the gap between I am capable and I am safe. They might introduce subtle, almost invisible criticisms, implying that the task is too large for anyone to handle perfectly, or perhaps that your dedication, while admirable, seems stretched too thin. This is not overt undermining. This is highly calibrated psychological assistance. They are helping you activate the anticipatory collapse because a self-destructed opponent requires zero external energy to defeat. Look closely at your own timeline. The career promotion you abandoned just before the interview. The relationships that ended precisely when the intimacy became truly profound. The creative projects that died on day 90 of a 100-day deadline. Many times these collapses were not caused by external insurmountable obstacles, but by a sudden, intense, almost chemical craving for the relief of stopping. You stop the race because the anxiety of possibly winning, and then having to defend that win, live up to that new standard, and face the vulnerability of true success, felt heavier and more terrifying than the simple, certain acceptance of defeat. The tragedy of the anticipatory collapse is that it fundamentally confuses protection with stagnation. In attempting to defend an idealized self, a ghost of potential that has never been tested, you become the architect of your own limits. You are protecting a version of yourself that technically exists only in the abstract. at the expense of the real, capable self that must actually face the world and risk the pain of objective failure. You have, quite literally, become the gatekeeper of your own prison cell, ensuring the walls never crumble, because even though they restrict you, they are walls you built and walls you understand. The manipulator's deepest secret is that they rarely need to plant the seeds of doubt. They only need to water the garden you already cultivated. You spent your life fearing the harsh verdict of the crowd, only to realize that the most consistent, most cruel, and most effective judge was the one you installed inside your own head. The certainty of failure, engineered entirely by your own protective hand, is the cage you mistakenly believe keeps you free. Exploitation of insecurities, the mapping of weaknesses, emotional cartography, the shadow audit. Have you ever had the unsettling realization that someone knew exactly which pressure point to touch, long before you even consciously acknowledged that point existed? It wasn't a moment of shared intuition. It was the quiet, terrifying outcome of a dedicated study. This stage of advanced psychological strategy is not about open conflict. It is about the cold, methodological process of emotional cartography, the mapping of weaknesses, and the meticulous construction of the shadow audit. Emotional cartography is the systematic, non-aggressive identification of another person's core relational needs, past unresolved traumas, and self-doubt narratives. This is the critical data collection phase, where the manipulator adopts the role of a meticulous, non-judgmental interviewer. They are not looking to debate or critique your life choices. They are simply listening for the specific language you use to describe your oldest wounds or the silent needs you bury deepest. It is surveillance disguised as empathy. They are not interested in the facade of strength you present to the world. They are interested in the structural integrity of your foundation, particularly the weak spots that you hide even from yourself. They ask gentle, probing questions, not to offer help, but to measure the dimensions of the void you carry. Imagine the manipulator as a master surveyor visiting a landscape shrouded in fog. They aren't swinging an axe or laying concrete yet. They are using highly sensitive seismic instruments, small, controlled questions, and subtle observational tests to plot the hidden fault lines beneath the surface of your identity. They watch for moments of immediate regression, the topics that make you over-explain, the compliments you immediately reject, or the small failures you cannot let go of. When you dismiss a genuine compliment by saying, "Oh, it was nothing, anyone could have done it," they mark the coordinates of your chronic self-minimization. When you passionately defend a past choice that was clearly flawed, they plot the exact location of your deepest cognitive dissonance. These are the markers on the emotional map, identifying where the ground is thinnest. The chilling paradox of this stage is that we often mistake this intense, unwavering focus required for mapping as deep, genuine connection. When someone truly listens, without rushing to offer advice or distracting us with their own narrative, we feel safe, seen, and profoundly understood. This feeling of safety is precisely what encourages us to willingly hand over the blueprints of our psychological infrastructure. The manipulator doesn't argue, they archive. They may ask, "What is the greatest professional failure that still stings?" Or, "What kind of validation do you feel you missed out on as a child?" And they watch where your eyes go, noting the precise language you use to describe those moments of vulnerability. This intense, non-reactive mirroring creates the perfect environment for us to conduct the shadow audit on ourselves, dutifully cataloging the levers and buttons for our eventual exploitation. They need to know if you are driven by the fear of abandonment, the terror of incompetence, or the desperate need for external approval. The answer determines the precise texture of the control they will later exert. This mapping process is drastically accelerated in the modern era of constant digital performance. While your Instagram feed provides the public data, the need for aesthetic approval, the frequency of validation seeking, the private mapping occurs during those late-night intimate conversations or even shared moments of crisis. They are not judging the content of your confession. They are gauging your primary emotional fuel. Is your engine powered by control, by certainty, by intellectual superiority? Or is it simply the quiet, desperate need for sanctuary and safety? Whatever you chase most desperately, whatever feels like the key to your wholeness, is the lever they will eventually use to steer you. They are identifying the exact mechanism of your internal motivation, knowing that manipulation is only successful when it makes the target feel like they are choosing the course of action for their own benefit. Realizing that your openness was treated not as intimacy, but as strategic intelligence means facing a chilling, existential truth. This discovery often generates a profound, agonizing self-distrust. You feel foolish not because you were tricked by an external force, but because you were the primary cartographer of your own confinement, meticulously drawing the lines for the psychological cage they would later build. You don't just distrust them, you distrust your own capacity for discernment and vulnerability. You question every moment of shared intimacy, wondering if it was a genuine exchange or merely a session of high-level strategic intelligence gathering. The map of your greatest insecurities is never discarded. It is archived, waiting for the precise moment when the structure of your self-trust must inevitably fall. Many stop here, they've had enough truth. But you didn't. Leave a like so I'll know you crossed that line. Love bombing, the tactic of emotional saturation. We move now to the most seductive tactic in the manipulator's arsenal, a technique that doesn't just lower your defenses but floods the system, rendering caution irrelevant. This is love bombing, the tactic of emotional saturation. Have you ever met someone, maybe only days ago, who suddenly seems to see every forgotten corner of your soul? Who validates every insecurity, praises every ambition, and promises a future so immediate, so perfectly tailored to your secret desires, that it feels like destiny. It is intoxicating, overwhelming, and, if you are being honest with yourself, fundamentally unnatural. Love bombing is the rapid, overwhelming application of affection, flattery, attention, and promises, designed to create instantaneous emotional debt and dependency. It is not about romance, it is a strategic maneuver borrowed directly from cult psychology, where intense, rapid bonding was necessary to sever the target's ties to their former identity and community. Its purpose is saturation. It's too much light, too much heat, too much validation, all delivered too fast. The velocity is the weapon. Imagine you are standing in an empty field, desiring a home. And within 48 hours, someone hands you the keys to a magnificent, fully furnished mansion. They insist you move in immediately. They tell you it was built just for you, designed exactly how you always wanted it. The keys are heavy with promise, the rooms glow with potential. You haven't checked the foundation, you haven't assessed the mortgage or the neighborhood. You haven't even paused long enough to ask why someone would give away something so priceless so quickly. You simply feel the gratitude, the validation of being chosen, and the immense pressure to accept this overwhelming gift before it vanishes. You become emotionally invested in the idea of the castle before you can properly inspect the structure. This is how the mechanism works. The love bomber is not falling in love with you. They are falling in love with the reflection of themselves they see in your intense adoration, or perhaps more precisely, they are studying your needs and mirroring them perfectly. They are using future pacing, creating an elaborate shared fantasy of marriage, travel, and eternal soulmate connection that pulls you forward before you have established any real present-day connection. This torrent of attention hijacks the prefrontal cortex, your center for judgment, caution, and risk assessment, and drowns it in dopamine and oxytocin. It feels validating, yes, because they are filling emotional voids you may not have known existed, but they are simultaneously testing your boundaries. Every boundary you allow them to cross under the guise of intimacy or intensity is logged as a successful breach. The manipulator is using the emotional saturation phase to measure exactly how compliant you are, how quickly you can be convinced to trust the feeling over the facts. In our modern, high-speed emotional landscape, love bombing is rampant. It thrives on dating apps and the social pressure to define relationships instantly. We confuse velocity with depth, mistaking the frantic, consuming energy of the love bomb for passionate commitment. If a relationship doesn't accelerate instantly to soulmate status, We often dismiss it as boring, but acceleration is what creates instability. Genuine trust requires gravity, friction, and, most importantly, time. The tragedy of the love bomb is not the eventual devaluation and discard. It is what it does to your future capacity for healthy intimacy. You learn to associate validation with extreme intensity. When the inevitable shift occurs, when the love bomber withdraws the light and begins the subtle, chilling phase of devaluation, you do not leave. You become hopelessly addicted to the memory of the saturation phase. You chase the fantasy of the perfect castle they showed you in those first 72 hours, believing that the true version of this person is buried somewhere beneath the cruelty. You are not chasing love. You are chasing the dopamine high of the initial tactical deployment. Understand this fundamental truth. Any intimacy that feels too good, too fast, often comes with hidden emotional leverage. True connection builds slowly, rooted in shared vulnerability and earned trust. Beware of the light that promises to eliminate all darkness instantly. Sometimes the brightest lights are designed merely to blind you to the cliff edge. Cultivation of dependence, the construction of need, the engineered void, manufacturing your missing piece. We spend so much of our waking energy pursuing fulfillment, a sense of wholeness, quiet certainty. But pause for a moment and consider a chilling possibility. What if the constant feeling of lacking something, that deep, unsettling itch you cannot scratch, was not a natural state of the human condition, but an intentional construct? This is the core of the fifth mechanism of subtle manipulation, the cultivation of dependence, often known in darker circles as the construction of need. It is the art of solving a problem that the manipulator first engineered into your life or psyche. It is a brilliant, insidious reversal of value creation, where the victim is not merely buying a product, but buying back a piece of autonomy that was quietly stolen. To understand this, we must shift our focus from mere transaction to psychological infrastructure. Most people define manipulation as overt lying or forceful persuasion. But the sophisticated operator knows true power lies in rendering the target fundamentally incapable of self-sufficiency. The definition of the cultivation of dependence is this: the systematic introduction of an external variable, a product, an idea, a person, a doctrine, that, while initially appearing to offer relief or completion, simultaneously erodes the internal mechanisms the target needs to operate independently. The manipulator doesn't just sell you a pill for the headache. They introduce the chemical that guarantees the headache recurs without their exclusive antidote. Imagine an architect commissioned to design a structure. Instead of building it soundly, he deliberately under-engineers a critical support beam, leaving it prone to subtle internal stress. A year later, sensing the imminent failure, he returns not as the culprit, but as the savior, selling the frightened owner an elaborate proprietary and permanent external bracing system, one that requires ongoing maintenance and exclusive parts. The owner now sees the architect as the source of stability, never realizing he was the origin of the instability. You are now perpetually indebted to the person who created your weakness. This is the illustration central to understanding manufactured need. You are purchasing the solution to a void that was specifically engineered for you to feel. The mechanism itself operates in two critical phases. First, there is the erosion of the intrinsic. This phase involves subtly devaluing your existing self-resources, your natural intuition, your inherent strength, your prior methods of coping. Experts, algorithms, and authority figures constantly suggest that your natural state is flawed, incomplete, or medically inadequate. You are too slow, too simple, too disorganized, or too sad without their specialized framework. The second phase is the substitution of the extrinsic. Once the internal anchor is questioned, the manipulator presents their fix as the inevitable, indispensable replacement. The paradox is devastating. The more you rely on this external fix for affirmation, emotional regulation, or strategic direction, the weaker your own internal resources become. The initial relief you feel is not healing. It is merely a psychological debt note against your future capacity for self-trust. We see this play out constantly in the modern emotional economy. Look at the self-improvement industry that profits infinitely more from the perpetual pursuit of perfection than from its actual achievement. Look at social platforms that convince you that your identity is unstable and incomplete until it is constantly validated by ephemeral external metrics, binding your self-worth to their algorithmically controlled approval loop. You are not buying community, you are subscribing to anxiety that only they can temporarily alleviate. You are taught that fulfillment is always the next purchase, the next certification, the next trend, always just out of reach, ensuring you remain a customer of necessity, not just desire. The impact of this engineered dependence is a profound shift in our locus of control. We cease to be sovereign individuals determining our own needs and become consumers perpetually responding to programmed insufficiencies. This leads to a constant low-grade existential anxiety, the nagging feeling that if you stop buying, following, or subscribing, the structure of your life will collapse. The system wins when you no longer remember how to stand on your own 2 feet, when you truly believe that the missing piece of your happiness is something you must purchase externally, rather than rediscover internally. True freedom is the recognition of which necessities are authentic requirements for human flourishing, and which are merely echoes of someone else's refined profit model. The deepest, most enduring prison is the one constructed entirely from necessary solutions to problems you never actually had until someone convinced you otherwise. Learned helplessness, the theory of abandonment. Learned helplessness, the comfort of the cage. Have you ever felt the strange relief that washes over you the moment you stop fighting? That deep, unexpected exhale when you finally accept that nothing you do matters in this specific situation? This isn't peace. It is the deep, dark psychological surrender known as learned helplessness. It is a theory born in the laboratories of experimental psychology, but it lives most profoundly in the quiet corners of your relationships and your mind. Learned helplessness is the condition of giving up control, not because you are actually trapped, but because you have been reliably taught that effort and outcome are unrelated. When control is repeatedly thwarted, when trying to fix a relationship only makes it worse, or when speaking up leads inevitably to deeper punishment, the brain executes a profound cognitive shift. It decides that the painful effort of seeking control is more detrimental than the safety of remaining inert. Imagine a heavily reinforced door. For months you have thrown your shoulder against it, believing freedom lies on the other side. Every push results in bruising, exhaustion, and silence. Then, one day, you stop. You sit down 20 feet away from the door, and the immense weight of required effort lifts instantly. You may not be free, but you are relieved of the painful burden of hope. What you don't realize is that the door may have been unlocked last week, but your nervous system has already compiled the final report. Pushing leads to pain, therefore stopping is survival. This is the psychological mechanism of the trap. Learned helplessness is a defense mechanism that misfires. It is your mind attempting to protect you from the crushing emotional tax of chronic disappointment. The highest cost in emotional life is not failure itself, but the repeated futile effort that precedes it. To avoid that cost, your brain optimizes for stillness. It calculates that if you truly believe you are helpless, you cease to be accountable for outcomes, and you cease to experience the debilitating anxiety of trying to change things that seem rigged against you. The paradox here is tragic. To avoid the pain of repeated failure, you willingly guarantee your own failure by refusing to engage. This is where manipulation finds its fertile ground. The true genius of the control dynamic is not forcing you into a cage. It is ensuring that you eventually build that cage for yourself, brick by learned helplessness brick. The manipulator's voice, the toxicity of the environment, or the trauma of the past stops being an external threat and becomes an internal operating principle. I am incapable. Nothing I do will change this. In modern life, this manifests as resignation. It is the partner who stops bringing up the issues that matter, not because they've been solved, but because every previous attempt led to explosive, useless conflict. It is the person who stays in the dead-end career because the perceived risk of starting over, of facing the potential pain of finding new walls, feels too high. You stop demanding the life you want because the risk of demanding it and failing is worse than the dull certainty of what you already have. You have traded aspiration for sedation. The profound psychological impact of learned helplessness is rooted in the theory of abandonment. It is not about someone else abandoning you, it is about you abandoning your future self. When you learn helplessness, you are effectively betraying the person you could become by submitting to the limitations dictated by your painful past. You abandon your own agency, your capacity for choice, and your inherent right to fight for a better reality. You become your own guard, enforcing the rules of your own confinement, because the cage is familiar, and outside that familiarity lies the volatile, terrifying realm of effort and potential disappointment. You have learned how to be comfortable while remaining utterly diminished. But remember this, the heaviest chain is not the one you cannot lift, but the one you believe is permanent. The false comfort of the cage is always more costly than the exhausting fight for the door. Emotional blackmail, the debt of sentiment. The quiet hours are when the real auditing happens. While you wait for sleep to claim you, the mind instinctively reviews the day's exchanges, assessing the emotional costs. This is where you encounter the concept that poisons trust more effectively than outright betrayal. Emotional blackmail, what we might call the debt of sentiment. Think about that specific, agonizing, hollow feeling, not of anger but of suffocating obligation. When a request is presented to you, not as a choice, but as the calculated collection of a historical debt. This is the weaponization of your shared history, the silent threat used to enforce compliance by leveraging the two things you fear losing most: acceptance and love. Emotional blackmail is defined precisely by the manipulative strategy of using fear, obligation, and guilt, the notorious fog, to compel another person to act in the manipulator's self-interest. It is a psychological transaction where love is presented as conditional upon adherence to an unspoken, often unreasonable, set of rules. The tactic is sinister because it attacks your identity. It forces you to choose between your personal integrity and your core need to maintain a bond with someone you care about. If you say no, you are not just saying no to the request, you are risking the immediate withdrawal of affection, or worse, the accusation of being ungrateful, selfish, or unloving. The core mechanism of this blackmail resides in the concept of the invisible ledger. Imagine that in certain relationships, every act of perceived kindness, every sacrifice, every moment of vulnerability you shared is meticulously logged, not as a gift freely given, but as collateral. This ledger is invisible to you, the recipient, until the moment the manipulator needs something they cannot secure through standard negotiation. At that point, they don't ask, they simply call in a debt. The debt may be decades old, a sacrifice made during their youth, a financial help offered years ago, or simply the fact of their role as a parent or partner. You are then held accountable for an unspoken balance, and the interest rate is always exorbitant. The tragedy here lies in the paradox. Genuine, mature love seeks the growth and autonomy of the other person. Emotional blackmail, using the very language of devotion, "I only do this because I love you," or "if you truly cared, you would," demands the immediate surrender of autonomy. The manipulator forces you into a state of cognitive dissonance. You know deep down that unconditional love should not have prerequisites, yet the psychological pressure to avoid the terrifying accusation of being a moral failure is often too great. You trade your personal freedom for temporary relief from guilt, purchasing a fragile, fleeting moment of peace until the next debt is called in. This subtle manipulation is rampant in modern life, often disguised within the cozy dynamics of family systems or the high-pressure environment of the modern workplace. It manifests when a parent says, "After everything I gave up for you to have this opportunity, you're going to throw it away now." Or when a partner counters a request for space with, "I guess I just don't matter to you anymore." It is the moment history is weaponized to prevent future choice. You are perpetually haunted by the ghosts of their past efforts, realizing that the narrative of your relationship is not one of mutual support, but one of calculated investment where the return is always compliance. The deep psychological impact of living under the shadow of the debt of sentiment is profound. It systematically erodes your ability to trust your own judgment. You stop evaluating choices based on what is right for you and start filtering every decision through the lens of their anticipated reaction. This constant fear of inciting their withdrawal, their silent disapproval, or their theatrical despair teaches you to prioritize their emotional needs over your own existence. You learn to perform love rather than feel it, reducing the beautiful complexity of attachment to a series of transactions aimed at maintaining the peace. This leads inevitably to chronic, simmering resentment and the crushing weight of internalized shame, forcing you into a role where you are perpetually trying to prove your worthiness for affection that should have been yours freely. As the night deepens, you must recognize this pattern for what it is. The most critical realization is this: true kindness is a gift that frees you. It does not place you in bondage. The worst thing about the debt of sentiment is that even when you pay the price demanded, even when you comply, the transaction never truly closes. The invisible ledger remains open, perpetually waiting for the next interest payment. True freedom begins when you accept that love without choice is merely captivity, and the only emotional debt you truly owe is to your own sense of self-respect. Guilt tripping, the maneuver of moral burden. We arrive now at the most intimate weapon in the manipulator's arsenal, the guilt trip, or as we should call it, the maneuver of moral burden. Have you ever found yourself agreeing to something, even as every fiber of your intuition screamed no, simply because the alternative was bearing the heavy, uncomfortable gaze of disappointment? That sensation is not spontaneous empathy. It is the calculated weight of moral debt being leveraged against you. It is the moment where your compliance becomes cheaper than enduring the emotional cost of refusal. A guilt trip is not merely expressing sadness or disappointment, which are natural human reactions. It is the tactical deployment of implied martyrdom. The manipulator positions themselves as the sacrificing party, the eternal victim, or the righteous guardian of a shared history. They convert their perceived suffering, or their history of favors, into an emotional currency that demands immediate repayment in the form of your compliance, your silence, or the complete surrender of your boundary. This tactic is profoundly effective because it relies entirely on your fundamental goodness, your inherent need to be perceived as kind, dutiful, or loyal. To understand the weight of this maneuver, imagine the relationship as a silent, invisible ledger. Every inconvenience they experienced for you, every past favor, every choice they made that they now regret, is tallied up not as a shared life experience, but as a debt owed by you, the debtor. The guilt trip is the collection notice. The moment you attempt to assert a boundary, you can't attend the event. You won't loan the money, you need space. They slide that ledger across the table. They don't need to yell, they only need to sigh heavily and invoke the great sacrifice. After everything I've done for you? That phrase, innocuous on the surface, is a demand for principal and interest on a moral loan you never formally accepted. This is where the tactic becomes truly insidious. The manipulation is not in the specific request itself, but in the existential penalty they impose for your refusal. The penalty is the revocation of your moral standing, the stripping away of your identity as a good son, daughter, friend, or partner. They frame your refusal not as a simple clash of legitimate needs, but as a moral failure, a profound betrayal of love, or a mark of profound ingratitude. The paradox is that genuine love and care seek your well-being, even when inconvenient, but weaponized care ensures your immediate compliance regardless of the cost to your spirit. They force you to choose between your genuine needs and your perceived identity as a good person. And psychologically, losing that internal sense of moral goodness often feels far more catastrophic than just conceding the point they are pushing. We see this mechanism extending far beyond the immediate family unit. In modern partnerships, it manifests when one person constantly chronicles their exhaustion and sacrifice, subtly positioning their needs as inherently more critical or urgent than yours, thus justifying their control over shared decisions. They are perpetually doing the most, ensuring that you always feel you are doing the least. In professional life, the boss who stays late for the team, but constantly reminds everyone of their personal sacrifice, is setting a moral trap, making refusal of extra, unpaid work feel like an act of professional disloyalty and moral negligence. You are trapped not by company policy, but by an expectation of reciprocal suffering, where setting limits feels like abandoning a wounded comrade. The long-term psychological fallout of living under this burden is the crippling of your autonomy. You begin to preemptively feel guilty, structuring your entire life around avoiding the emotional explosion of the manipulator. Your decisions are no longer guided by your genuine values, your energy levels, or your needs, but by the avoidance of moral retribution. You live under a perpetual, self-imposed surveillance, constantly scanning for opportunities to proactively repay the debt you never asked for. This creates a state of chronic anxiety and anticipatory dread where true rest and freedom become impossible because the balance sheet of duty is never ever settled. To recognize the guilt trip is to understand that genuine love and connection never require the subjugation of the self. Any relationship that demands your psychological erosion as payment for its existence is not a bond of mutuality. It is a business transaction cloaked in sentiment. Your primary duty is not to maintain the comfort of the manipulator, but to safeguard the integrity of your own truth. Creation of obligation, the gift as investment, the irreversible law of reciprocal debt. We are taught to cherish generosity, to see the gift as pure, free, and disconnected from the harsh realities of commerce. But have you ever received something truly expansive, deeply personalized, perhaps even expensive, and felt a quiet, internal panic settle in your chest? That feeling, subtle and unsettling, is the immediate acknowledgement of the ledger opening. That is the invoice arriving before the package has even been unwrapped. It is the instinctive awareness that true generosity, in the unforgiving landscape of human interaction, rarely exists without an asterisk. This is the moment we confront the economic reality hidden within social gestures, the creation of obligation. The true gift, in socio-psychological terms, is an investment. It is the tactical transfer of capital, not monetary, but moral and emotional, from giver to receiver. The act of gifting is fundamentally an act of initiation, a preemptive move that establishes the recipient's place in a system of reciprocal debt. It demands a return, and crucially, it demands that the return be calculated, unequal, and strategically delayed, ensuring the relationship remains active and the power dynamic tilted in favor of the initiator. Imagine the master manipulator, or simply the highly intuitive person, playing this subtle game. They give you the perfect, expensive item, something you mentioned in passing months ago and had forgotten. The timing is impeccable, the gesture selfless, thoughtful, requiring no immediate thanks beyond simple appreciation. They explicitly tell you, don't worry about it, just enjoy it. But the ledger is open. The moral debt has been established, hovering invisibly in the air between you. Now, months later, when they ask you for a large favor that inconveniences your life significantly, perhaps canceling a long-planned personal trip to help them navigate a professional crisis, your ability to say no has been fundamentally crippled. The gift wasn't a transaction that closed. It was a prepayment on your autonomy, securing your compliance for a future withdrawal. Why is this debt so uniquely binding, so psychologically potent? It weaponizes our innate need for social solvency. We fear being categorized as an ingrate, a taker, or a moral debtor. The power of the strategic gift lies in the ambiguity of the required repayment. If the gift cost $500, the repayment is rarely meant to be $500 cash. It must cost slightly more or be vastly different in nature, requiring a greater expenditure of time, access, loyalty, or emotional labor. The receiver is instantly burdened by the requirement to calculate this intangible interest. If you try to repay too quickly or too equally, you insult the sincerity of the original gesture, implying you saw it merely as a cheap exchange. If you wait too long, You confirm your status as a person who exploits kindness. The coercive element is perfectly masked in the timing and the type of required return, turning apparent benevolence into a sophisticated, weighted leash. This mechanism pervades modern life. Consider the workplace, the boss who grants you that massive, unexpected bonus, or the senior colleague who pulls strings to get you a major opportunity you weren't qualified for. They are cementing loyalty that transcends salary. They didn't pay you solely for your past work. They purchased your future compliance, guaranteeing your silence and effort during the inevitable crunch time. We see it in dating, where excessive early spending traps the recipient into feeling they owe attention or physical presence, substituting economic leverage for emotional connection. We see it in politics, where donations are simply formalized prepayments for legislative access or specialized consideration. The purest form of leverage today is not found in open threats, but in meticulously calculated strategic generosity. The deep psychological impact of understanding this dynamic is the loss of pure gratitude. Once you recognize the gift as an investment designed to create a dependent relationship, every act of kindness, no matter how small, must be filtered through a lens of cost-benefit analysis. This realization is painful. It doesn't make you cynical. It makes you intensely aware of the invisible chains we willingly fasten around ourselves in the pursuit of social comfort. It forces you to calculate the true cost of free things, teaching you that emotional freedom often requires the difficult, uncomfortable act of rejecting unsolicited generosity. The truly liberating gift is the one you refuse, because when you accept the perfect offering, meticulously chosen and sincerely presented, you are not just receiving kindness, you are signing a contract written entirely in their favor, agreeing to pay the interest rate of another person's deep, unspoken needs. Triangulation, the geometry of conflict. The concept we need to pull into the quiet space now, as the external world softens and the internal monologue sharpens, is triangulation, the geometry of conflict. Have you ever been in a conversation or a relationship where suddenly the primary dynamic you thought you had with a partner, a boss, or a trusted friend felt diluted, shifted, or judged by the shadow of someone who wasn't even physically present? That strange, specific feeling of having the air leak out of a private connection is often the first subtle symptom of psychological triangulation. Triangulation is fundamentally the introduction of a third element into a two-person emotional system, executed deliberately to stabilize or, more commonly, destabilize the primary bond, depending on the operator's motive. It is a control mechanism, but first and foremost, it is an escape from the responsibility of direct communication. Instead of addressing conflict or insecurity directly with you, the manipulator pulls in a third party, an ally, an audience, an idealized rival, or even a scapegoat, to diffuse responsibility, divert scrutiny, or incite jealousy and insecurity. To truly see it, imagine a tightly stretched rubber band between two people, representing trust, attention, and energy. When triangulation occurs, the manipulator doesn't cut the band. They simply hook it over a third, stationary pole located somewhere off-frame. Now, the tension isn't purely between A and B. It's divided, redirected, and often amplified because the emotional energy that should be fixing the original connection is now fighting the ghost of that third party. You are no longer focused on resolving the issue with the person opposite you. You are forced to focus on proving your worth against the benchmark they keep referencing. Why is this manipulation so profoundly effective? Because it forces the creation of three toxic, interlocking roles, often known as the drama triangle, yet applied with a subtle twist. The persecutor, the one running the pattern. The victim, the target, often left feeling inadequate. And the rescuer or idealized other, the third party, who is either praised lavishly or viciously slandered, depending on the immediate need of the manipulator. Crucially, the target of triangulation is forced into a state of perpetual instability because they don't know which version of the third party is real. If the manipulator praises the idealized rival excessively, Why can't you be more successful, dedicated, or understanding like X? You are left feeling insufficient, striving to reach an unobtainable standard. If, however, they begin to slander the rival intensely, X is trying to undermine us, we are the only two people who see the truth. You become their unwitting confidant, locking you into a false alliance based on shared suspicion or hatred. The mechanism ensures you are perpetually focused outward, either striving against a ghost of perfection or aligning against a perceived external threat, instead of looking inward at the inherent lack of integrity in the two-person dynamic itself. Your attention is fragmented, your focus is weaponized, and your effort is wasted fighting shadows. This geometry of conflict isn't restricted to dramatic personal relationships. You see this toxic pattern in office politics, where the manager plays two ambitious employees against each other by subtly praising one's metrics to the other, creating a constant state of insecure rivalry rather than collaborative effort. You see it in family dynamics, where a primary relationship only communicates critical observations about one person through a third, distant mediator. And increasingly, you see it in the online landscape, where engagement is maintained by influencers constantly creating and amplifying drama between their followers and a perceived enemy or rival group. It weaponizes comparison. It ceases to be about your inherent actions or your moral character. It immediately becomes about your relative standing to the third, shifting point. The psychological toll is devastating because it shatters your fundamental sense of relational reality. You are constantly searching for external validation against a standard that is explicitly designed to shift daily, defined entirely by the insecurities of the manipulator. You begin to doubt the sanctity and safety of your own private connections. Where is the refuge? If every relationship can be instantly outsourced, judged, or influenced by an invisible audience, then genuine intimacy and vulnerable trust become impossible luxuries. You are left emotionally drained, not by the clarity of a direct conflict, but by the relentless, geometric complexity of maneuvering a three-person system when your core self was only designed for two. Understand this before you close your eyes. Triangulation is not about finding better allies or achieving a higher standard. It is about guaranteeing chronic instability and imbalance. The only true way to win the geometry of conflict is to recognize the pattern, refuse to step onto the third point, locate the original tension, and draw the line back to the essential two. Let the rest of the destructive shape dissolve in the silence. Hoovering, the strategy of suction. Hoovering, the strategy of suction. There is a precise psychological moment, a moment of profound, vulnerable quiet, where many people who escape intense manipulative relationships are often drawn back. It is the silence after the storm, the deep breath you finally take, believing the destructive cycle has ended. But the destructive cycle is rarely ended by you. It is often just paused by them. This pause is merely preparation for the mechanism known as hoovering, the strategy of suction. Hoovering is not an act of reconciliation, nor is it the genuine pursuit of a dissolved bond. It is a calculated, often cold, maintenance tactic designed solely to reestablish control over a valuable emotional supply line that has dared to disconnect. The term, borrowing its name from the well-known vacuum cleaner, perfectly illustrates the dynamic. An intense, temporary burst of suction aimed at drawing stray elements back into the machine's orbit. If you have ever been the person who tried to leave, who implemented the dreaded no-contact rule, you understand the eerie inevitability of this returning pressure. The manipulator, let's call them the engineer of suction, knows your psychological vulnerabilities better than you do, especially your residual empathy. They know that your boundaries are new and still permeable. Hoovering is designed to target two specific cognitive distortions you carry: the chronic hope that they will finally change, and the lingering cognitive dissonance that argues, despite all the evidence, that the relationship was perhaps not that bad. Imagine a lighthouse. You have successfully navigated away from the treacherous rocky shore. You are in deep water, finally finding safety. The hoovering signal is that lighthouse changing its beacon. Instead of flashing a warning, it projects the soft, reassuring light of your fondest memory. The person you initially fell for, the potential they represented, the beautiful lie they sold you. It's an irresistible illumination promising warmth, aimed directly at your most frozen, isolated part. How does the engineer generate this suction? They use surgical precision. They do not come back demanding or attacking. They come back vulnerable, wounded, and seemingly redeemed. They invoke shared trauma, lament their own loneliness, or suddenly experience a miraculous moment of clarity where they confess every fault you ever accused them of. The apology is massive, overwhelming, and emotionally exhaustive. It is a performance so convincing that you feel cruelty in maintaining your distance. You are not protecting yourself, you are hurting a broken soul. This is the central conflict, your rational understanding of past pain versus your innate human desire to alleviate suffering. The engineer exploits this tension, betting on your compassion to override your self-preservation instinct. The goal is simple, to make you open the door, even just a crack. They do not need you to come rushing back. They just need access to your emotional landscape again. Once the door is opened, the confession stops being about their redemption and starts being about your obligations. The vacuum turns off the apology setting and reverts instantly to its default setting, entitlement. In the modern context, this strategy plays out in the digital shadows. The late-night text that simply says, "I was driving by our old spot," or "I saw this and instantly thought of you." The email that arrives sounding less like an ex and more like a poet confessing a broken life. It is the carefully staged public interaction where they look thinner, sadder, and utterly defeated. A visual plea designed to trigger the hero or healer within you. The profound damage of successful hoovering is that it does not just drag you back into the pain. It systematically destroys your internal architecture of boundary maintenance. Every time you concede, your subconscious learns a disastrous lesson. Boundaries are temporary suggestions, and distance is futile. You institutionalize the belief that escape is not possible, and that your only permanent state is being tethered. You lose faith in your own judgment, transforming the manipulative pattern from an external event into an internal expectation. When the suction begins, you must remember the mechanics of the machine. The vacuum does not have affection for the dust it collects. It simply requires the dust to operate its motor. That comforting, familiar pull is not love reaching out. It is control attempting to re-establish physics. Do not mistake the familiar vibration of the vacuum for the sound of your heart finally settling. The silence you fought for is not emptiness. It is the crucial, necessary space where you finally begin breathing your own uncontaminated air again. The scapegoat, the transfer of collective shadow. You ever notice how much easier it is to hate a single, clear villain than it is to admit a complex, systemic failure? That sudden, overwhelming psychological relief, that burst of shared righteous indignation, isn't accidental. It is the core function of the scapegoat mechanism, the transfer of the collective shadow, and it is manipulation at its most sophisticated and ruthless. This practice is not merely an ancient ritual of sacrifice. It is the most efficient social tool for psychic sanitation. It defines what happens when a group, community, or society, unable or unwilling to face its own accumulated weaknesses, hypocrisies, and failures, its collective shadow, must find a vessel to carry that contamination away. The scapegoat doesn't just absorb blame. It absorbs the group's unintegrated darkness, its latent violence, and its suppressed shame. Think of it this way. Imagine a massive, pristine psychological container. Over time, every member of the group, through small compromises, ethical lapses, and acts of avoidance, dumps a certain amount of psychological grime into the container. This accumulation becomes heavy, oppressive, threatening the group's self-image as good and moral. Cleaning it requires difficult, painful internal work, mass accountability, and deep structural change. That is too costly. The manipulator knows this. Instead of demanding responsibility, they provide a simple solution. Nominate one person or one easily definable external group, the scapegoat, and ritually load all the accumulated grime, all the shadow, onto them. Then they are cast out, metaphorically or literally destroyed. The relief is instantaneous and intoxicating. The collective breathes a sigh of clean conscience. We are good because they are bad. We are moral because they are the source of corruption. The group cohesion tightens dramatically, bonded by shared righteous hate directed outward. This externalization of guilt is the ultimate defense mechanism for a fragile collective ego. The paradox here is critical, and it's where the manipulation reveals its brilliance. The very traits, actions, or fears that the group projects onto the scapegoat are often the precise things the group secretly fears about itself. The intensity of the hatred directed outward is directly proportional to the magnitude of the self-deception held within. The more fiercely a society hunts an external flaw, the more assuredly you know that flaw is thriving, unrecognized, at its center. When you see mass fixation, mass outrage, and the singular focus on an external enemy, understand that the true enemy, the systemic, accumulated flaw, still resides internally, now masked by the temporary euphoria of manufactured purity. Manipulation hinges on providing this purity cheaply. The leader doesn't solve the problem. They point to the sacrificial lamb and offer you instant alignment, instant righteousness, and the temporary permission to bypass your own difficult internal processing. The only price is the sacrifice of truth. Look at modern media and political cycles. The scapegoat is now digitized, constantly refreshed, and served up hourly. It might be a trending personality, a specific political faction, a geopolitical rival, or a cultural movement that deviates from the norm. This continuous offering of externalized evil prevents genuine, painful self-reflection in the system and in the individual. Your anxiety about the complexity of the world, your guilt about consumerism, your private sense of ethical compromise, it all gets transferred into the digital effigy. You click share on the outrage, and for 30 seconds you feel morally superior, aligning yourself with the purified majority. The scapegoat absorbed your shadow so you didn't have to confront it in your own reflection. The deep psychological impact of recognizing this is profound. When you observe a massive spike in collective rage, you must stop asking, "What did they do?" and start asking, "What is the collective refusing to own? What unintegrated shame is this group desperate to expel?" This insight changes your role entirely, moving you from a feverish participant in the ritual to a sober, detached observer of the underlying psychological dynamics. This recognition grants you a powerful immunity to the cheap, addictive energy of borrowed outrage. The collective shadow only has power when it remains unconscious and externalized. The only lasting way to defeat the scapegoat mechanism, both politically and personally, is to integrate your own shadow. Because if you consciously carry your own darkness, your flaws, your imperfections, your capacity for harm, you can no longer be fooled into joining the crowd that demands an innocent vessel for their collective unconscious shame. You recognize the transaction for what it is, the trading of truth for temporary comfort. Halfway through, maybe your body rests, but your subconscious is still listening. Subscribe, and let's keep unfolding the human mind together. Memory manipulation, the rewriting of personal history. We arrive now at the quiet, psychological apex of control, the rewriting of personal history. This is the moment where manipulation ceases to be about influencing a decision and becomes about destroying the source code of identity itself. Think back to a moment of sharp conflict, a confrontation, or a painful realization. You remember the words spoken, the emotions felt, the undeniable truth of that event as you experienced it. Now imagine if that perfect recollection, that internal witness you trust implicitly, was actually the most vulnerable part of your psyche. How deeply would you have to doubt yourself if the past you know is suddenly painted as the past you invented? This technique moves beyond simple denial or deflection. It seeks to destabilize your entire sense of self by surgically altering the archive you rely on, your autobiographical memory. The official psychological term for this process on a grand scale is historical revisionism, but in personal dynamics, it is the sophisticated weapon of the highly manipulative personality. The goal isn't just to make you comply today, it's to ensure you can never build a compelling case against the manipulator tomorrow because the evidence, your memory, has been systematically corrupted. Imagine your mind is a library, vast and meticulously cataloged. The manipulator doesn't burn the books. They simply replace key pages in the index. You pull out the file for the argument of last Tuesday, and it reads exactly as the manipulator dictated. You were irrational. You misunderstood the context. Your reaction was disproportionate. You have the physical folder, the proof you accessed the file, but the content inside is a sophisticated forgery. You are left holding a ghost memory, a vivid recollection of the process of remembering, but an unreliable, contaminated conclusion. The terror of this mechanism lies in the nature of memory itself. You assume memory is playback, a perfect recording that simply needs to be accessed. But cognitive science confirms it is reconstruction. Every time you recall an event, you are actively rebuilding it, and that rebuilding process is deeply influenced by recent input, context, and emotional pressure, particularly when the source of that pressure is trusted or intimately involved in your emotional stability. The manipulator doesn't have to erase the memory completely. They just have to provide a compelling, relentless alternative script. It didn't happen that way. You confuse things. You always remember it wrong. When this message is repeated with enough conviction, coercive attachment, and apparent certainty, your own neural pathways begin to prioritize the external narrative over the internal feeling of knowing. Over time, your brain, desperate for coherence and connection, begins to internalize the external revisionist history. The brain prefers a consistent, though painful, narrative over the chaos of uncertainty. This psychological erosion is what keeps individuals locked in toxic cycles for years. The relationship is fundamentally unstable, defined by emotional abuse or deep imbalance, but every time the victim tries to leave, they hit a wall of self-doubt and internal contradiction. Was it really that bad? Maybe I was too sensitive. I must be exaggerating. The history of abuse is not simply ignored. It is redefined as misunderstanding, overreaction, or even the victim's mistake. You are forced to live with a dual chronology, the felt reality, the emotional scars, and the official imposed reality, the words spoken by the one holding the narrative authority. And the imposed reality, backed by external certainty, often wins the daily battle for sanity and peace. The ultimate philosophical consequence of successful memory manipulation is the severing of the self from its own continuity. Your identity is a narrative you tell yourself, supported by the evidence of your experiences. If that evidence is compromised, your current self becomes unstable. You lose the anchor of your own experience, floating untethered between what you felt and what you were told you felt. You become perpetually focused on defining the past rather than living in the present. You are essentially living as a supporting character in someone else's autobiography, perpetually searching for the protagonist you used to be. You cease to trust your gut because your gut has been labeled faulty by the only witness you had left, your own mind. The true fight for freedom, then, is the desperate, silent struggle to believe the primary source material, the testimony written within your own bones before the editor arrived. Cognitive dissonance, internal conflict as leverage, the self-deception economy. Think about the moment right before you lie to yourself, not to others, but to yourself. That tiny, excruciating friction when what you know to be true collides violently with what you desperately need to believe. It is the moment when reality introduces a non-negotiable expense, and your psyche scrambles to find the cheapest way to pay the bill. This tension, this internal electrical shock, is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. It is the inescapable discomfort you feel when you hold two or more conflicting ideas, values, or behaviors simultaneously. It is not just confusion, it is psychological pain. And the human mind is fundamentally engineered to eliminate pain, often at any cost. We are not designed to live in contradiction. We are designed to resolve it instantly, even if that resolution requires bending reality or deleting inconvenient facts. The consistency of the self is more valuable to the ego than the accuracy of the world. Imagine you have invested years, your reputation, your time, your emotional sanity into a project, a relationship, or even a deeply flawed belief system. Let's say you finally receive undeniable proof that this investment is toxic, that it is actively harming you. Logically, the correct move is to walk away and minimize further damage. But walking away means admitting the years were wasted, that your intelligence failed you, or that your loyalty was misplaced. This admission of loss is the source of the deepest dissonance. Your mind faces a choice. It can acknowledge the harm and accept the true, objective loss, thereby validating the suffering, a massive ego blow. Or it can engage in a psychological magic trick, justification. The dissonance demands resolution, and justification is the cheapest path because it requires no physical effort, only narrative remodeling. You don't change the behavior, leaving, you change the story. You begin to invent layers of rationalization. They only hurt me because they love me too much, or this pain is necessary for the unique growth I'm receiving here. The crucial mechanism here is called the effort justification principle. The more effort, pain, or sacrifice you put in, the more valuable you must perceive the outcome to be, simply to justify the effort you already exerted. You don't leave the toxic environment precisely because you paid too high a price to get there. You can't afford to admit the investment was unsound, so you inflate the value of the returns. This is where the unseen leverage and manipulation is found. A skilled operator does not demand a massive sacrifice immediately. They ask for a small, slightly contradictory behavior, a tiny lie, a minor concession that clashes with your stated self-image. Once you comply, you must justify that action to yourself. You have to adjust your belief system to match the behavior you just performed. If you believe yourself to be honest, but you just told a small lie for the benefit of the group, you must now convince yourself that honesty is secondary to loyalty, or that the specific lie was somehow a higher form of truth. This is the foot-in-the-door technique weaponized by your own internal need for coherence. Your psychological architecture forces you to become the willing architect of your own compliance. You become fiercely protective of the very system or person that caused the initial conflict simply because you invested your moral currency to resolve the conflict they initiated. Your mind rationalizes the discomfort away by convincing you that the discomfort was actually the goal. What changes inside us is chilling, the complete erosion of reliable internal navigation. Every time you justify a contradiction, you train your brain to prioritize psychological comfort over objective truth. You lose the ability to trust your initial gut response, that primal signal of dissonance that warns you of inconsistency. Over time, the gap between what you know and what you say disappears entirely, replaced by a seamless, self-serving narrative. You stop lying to yourself and genuinely start believing the lie, effectively replacing your core self with the version required by the manipulator or the environment. The manipulator never needed to build a cage for you. They just provided the conflicting elements, and you, needing to resolve the tension, built the perfect reinforced bars around yourself. You are locked in by your own need for consistency, convinced that the key is flawed, not the lock. Exploitation of empathy. Empathy as a resource to extract. Welcome to the deep mechanism of compassion, where warmth meets calculus. We are examining the silent market where your best intentions are traded against your well-being. This is the empathy arbitrage. What if the deepest connection you felt with another human being was precisely the thing being measured and priced against your own self-interest? That tight, uncomfortable knot in your chest when someone you care about expresses distress. That isn't just the inherent cost of being human. For the skilled manipulator, it is psychological leverage. It is a resource to be extracted. Empathy. Arbitrage is the calculated practice of treating human compassion, your innate, biological willingness to internalize and alleviate the pain of others, not as a virtue to be respected, but as a reserve of energy to be strategically depleted. It is founded on the chilling calculation that your need to restore emotional balance in the relationship by solving their problem is fundamentally stronger than your need for self-preservation or boundary maintenance. The exploiter understands that the path of least resistance for you is often the path of greatest depletion. To truly see this mechanism, consider the emotional mortgage. The manipulator constantly presents manufactured, cyclic, or slightly exaggerated crises. They rarely ask for tangible help directly. Instead, they display a level of acute distress calibrated precisely to bypass your rational, critical defenses. They do not need your advice. They need your reaction. When you step in to absorb the pain, stabilize the drama, or sacrifice your own schedule, you are lending emotional capital. They hold the deed to your compassion, securing a dependency through your sense of responsibility. You pay the interest daily through exhaustion, stress, and anxiety, yet the principal debt, their manufactured neediness, never decreases. The deeper mechanism relies on creating a state of perpetual sympathy fatigue, subtly masked as noble sacrifice or indispensable martyrdom. The exploiters engineer an environment where the absence of your help is explicitly defined, implicitly or explicitly, as a moral failure on your part. This is where the tension truly begins. The manipulator understands that for a highly empathetic, conscientious person, the internal pain of disappointing or abandoning someone in perceived need is catastrophically greater than the external cost of being used. This dynamic transcends mere emotional debt. It becomes a state of moral leverage. It forces you into an unbearable choice. Either preserve your psychological boundaries and appear selfish, cold, or cruel, or embrace self-sacrificial exhaustion and feel temporarily righteous. The manipulator has trained you to believe that the only moral position is the one that costs you the most. They utilize your own wiring, your need for congruence between your actions and your values, against you, making self-care feel inherently dishonest. Look closely at your modern life, beyond the intimate relationships. This arbitrage is present in the colleague who constantly weaponizes tears or panic to avoid responsibility, knowing your organizational empathy will compel you to step in. It is in the friend who calls only when their world is ending, ensuring your role remains strictly that of emergency responder, never equal partner. They are deliberately utilizing your mirror neurons, knowing that when they display weakness, your system automatically triggers the caretaker response, effectively overriding critical judgment about whether the crisis is genuine, repeated, or deliberately orchestrated. The psychological impact of living under empathy arbitrage is profound and deeply destructive. Constant extraction forces the development of a protective, necessary callousness. You begin to question the authenticity of all suffering. You are left with two equally painful options. You either shut down your empathic channels entirely, choosing numbness and isolation to survive, or you submit to complete psychological burnout, sacrificing your own internal world to service a manufactured dependency that will never truly be satisfied. Crucially, you lose the ability to differentiate between a genuine, desperate plea for help and a carefully crafted request for submission. Your finely tuned instrument of compassion is dulled by overuse. You must be vigilant about who gets to hold the psychological blueprints to your kindness. If your empathy is being treated like a non-renewable bank vault, a constant source of withdrawals with no deposits, then you must change the combination and enforce strict limits on access. The truly valuable resource is not your pain for others, but your reserved, protected capacity to heal and steward your own self. Guard that. Stockholm Syndrome, Attachment to Power. Tonight, we dissect the dark alchemy known as Stockholm Syndrome. Not just the bank heist version you read about in textbooks, but the subtle, systemic attachment you form to the very structures and patterns that hold you captive. Have you ever found yourself vigorously defending a draining job, an emotionally absent partner, or a deeply dysfunctional ideology simply because the alternative, the void of true, unstructured freedom, felt exponentially more terrifying than the comfortable misery you already knew? That deep, confusing loyalty to a source of suffering is the internal echo of a powerful yet profoundly misdirected survival mechanism. Stockholm Syndrome, named for the 1973 bank robbery in Sweden, describes the profound psychological phenomenon where a victim develops positive feelings, allegiance, or even affection for their aggressor. But let's recontextualize this beyond handcuffs and vaults. At its heart, it is a desperate adaptation strategy. When a person finds themselves in a situation of extreme power imbalance, where escape is impossible and the threat of harm is constant, the mind performs a radical cognitive shift. It instinctively identifies with the aggressor. The hope is that by showing compliance, empathy, or attachment, the victim might garner pity, favors, or simply non-lethal treatment. The source of your pain suddenly becomes the precarious source of your temporary security. To grasp how this applies to manipulation in daily life, visualize this intense scenario. Imagine being lost and hypothermic in a desolate, frozen landscape. Eventually, a harsh, unforgiving mountaineer finds you, but instead of offering unconditional warmth, he forces you to carry heavy supplies, dictates every step with cruelty, and constantly threatens to abandon you to the elements if you slow down. You despise the situation, yet when he finally offers you a meager, lukewarm sip of water, an act barely enough to sustain you, a profound rush of gratitude floods your system. You clutch that moment of nonviolence. You see the tiny sip of water as irrefutable proof of his fundamental goodness, rather than just a strategic necessity to keep his labor alive. Your immediate survival now hinges entirely on pleasing and thus rationalizing the source of your misery. The core conflict in systemic attachment is the immense cognitive dissonance required to maintain the loyalty. To survive psychologically within a toxic structure, be it an abusive relationship or a controlling system, you must aggressively filter out the sustained cruelty and amplify the rare moments of reprieve or kindness. You begin rationalizing the oppression. They had a bad day. The system is flawed but fundamentally necessary. My obedience is the only thing keeping the peace. Crucially, the victim often internalizes the aggressor's narrative, accepting that they are the problem, or that the system's restrictive demands are reasonable given the circumstances. This self-blame is a desperate attempt to gain a semblance of control, because if the abuse is demonstrably your fault, then logically, fixing yourself means the abuse stops. If the abuse is arbitrary, external, and non-negotiable, you are rendered utterly powerless. Look at your professional or ideological life today. We see this mechanism play out in toxic corporate environments where employees defend relentless schedules and abusive management, not out of true belief in the mission, but because the rigid structure, painful as it is, provides definition, income, and status. In intimate relationships, this manifests when you confuse extreme familiarity with intrinsic security, believing that the known cycles of pain are definitively safer than the terrifying potential of a healthy, yet unknown, future. The most insidious manipulation is the one that convinces you that your suffering is actually a necessary and unavoidable component of your continued safety and existence. And what does this attachment ultimately cost you? It strips you of authentic agency. When you form an attachment to power, any power, benign or oppressive, you inevitably outsource your self-worth. Your value is no longer inherent. It is granted to you by the system you serve, or the person who controls the pain switch. The profound psychological tragedy of systemic Stockholm syndrome is that the victim often becomes the most fervent and tireless defender of the prison walls, tragically mistaking the mere absence of current brutality for the authentic presence of justice, security, or genuine love. Be vigilant when you find yourself instinctively thanking the hand that holds the leash. Sometimes, the most profound act of emotional freedom is simply recognizing that the only thing keeping the cage intact is the perverse affection you have developed for the keeper. Cultivation of a false identity, the construction of the alter ego, the inversion of self, building the strategic ghost. You've spent your life collecting fragments of identity, tastes, fears, habits. These pieces make up the core self you carry, flawed and often reactive, but lie still. Tonight, we look at a profound moment of strategic detachment, The instant the architect of influence realizes their authentic self is a liability and decides that only a perfectly engineered performance will suffice. What if the most powerful version of you is the one that must be entirely manufactured? This is not merely putting on a brave face. This is the disciplined cultivation of a false identity, a specialized, strategic alter ego. It is born from a cold, pragmatic realization that your genuine vulnerabilities are weaknesses that competitors, critics, or targets can and will exploit. The strategic identity, therefore, is the psychological armored suit meticulously designed not to reflect who you are, but precisely what you need the world to believe you are. It is the perfect answer to the question, what identity profile achieves my desired outcome? Imagine yourself not as a person, burdened by history and inherent traits, but as a piece of finely engineered clockwork. Every tick, every gear rotation must serve the singular, overarching function of influence and control. The manipulator doesn't just act confident. They meticulously audit and remove the psychological infrastructure that allows self-doubt, moral hesitation, or emotional softness to exist. They study the emotional voids and predictable needs of others, and then they design an identity specifically calibrated to fill that void with an aura of certainty, competence, or desirable mystery. The tools of construction are silence, observation, and relentless practice. The false identity is built using external feedback loops. Did that performance inspire awe? Did that measured pause create submission? If yes, that element is retained and polished. If no, it is discarded. You are essentially sculpting a public narrative, turning your own history into a manageable script, discarding inconvenient truths, and exaggerating useful fictions. This self-construction is an act of supreme psychological willpower, dedicated to minimizing internal friction that might betray the performance. The profound conflict inherent in this process is the necessity of self-erasure. To wear the mask effectively, you must forget what the face beneath felt like. This is not faking it until you make it. It's faking it until the faking becomes the new, immutable structure of reality. The true cost is internal bifurcation. The individual must sustain the strategic identity while simultaneously suppressing the original self, the memory of which is treated as a dangerous ghost, locked away for fear it might leak an authentic, damaging truth. The energy required to maintain this facade is immense, yet it is sustained and validated by the successful feedback loops of manipulation. Success reinforces the lie, reinforcing the strategic identity until the initial, genuine you becomes a faint memory. This is why manipulators often seem to have an impenetrable consistency. Their actions are not driven by unpredictable emotion, but by strategic programming. We see minor blueprints of this every day in the curated performances of the modern world, the hyper-professional personas, the digital perfection. Society conditions us to trust the polished surface. The true architect of manipulation simply takes this societal requirement for superficial perfection and pushes it to its logical, absolute extreme, replacing spontaneity with strategic, practiced reaction. The final psychological toll of the constructed identity is the loss of internal coherence. You become the ultimate pragmatist, fundamentally divorced from intrinsic personal values. Your beliefs, your morals, even your moments of genuine pleasure are treated merely as tools to advance the strategy. When the manipulation succeeds, the reward is external power and control. But internally, you find only the silent echo chamber of the constructed self, forever listening for the sound of the authentic person that was sealed away. There is no longer a witness to your internal life, only a relentless stage manager. The most powerful illusion is ultimately the one you build for yourself. And the deepest consequence of strategic performance is realizing, late one night when the audience is gone, that the mask no longer comes off because there is nothing left underneath to save. Sleep now and consider the weight of the faces you choose to show the world. Mind control, sovereignty under influence. We call this concept the hijacked consciousness. Do you truly control the direction of your thoughts? Or are you merely navigating a landscape that someone else meticulously designed? We often confuse the ability to choose with the true freedom of defining what choices are even possible. Pause for a moment in the quiet dark and consider the possibility that your core operating system, your foundational assumptions about reality, was not self-written. This is the essence of sovereignty under influence. It is not about brute force or direct command. That is amateur manipulation. True high-level psychological control is the curation of your environment and information stream until the only logical conclusion, the only emotionally satisfying response, is the one the influence needs you to reach. This is control by the gentle directional guidance of your internal compass, where the resulting path feels exactly like instinct. If you want to grasp the subtlety of this mechanism, imagine yourself in a vast, ornate library. You are told you are absolutely free. You may choose any book in this magnificent space. You walk the aisles, you study the spines, and you eventually select one volume, proud of your autonomy. But what if the curator, silently and weeks prior, had removed every book except three, the three specific volumes that reinforce the curator's preferred narrative? Your choice was real. You picked one of the three, but your sovereignty, your foundational freedom to select from the universe of knowledge, was entirely illusory. The deepest form of control is the power to set the boundaries of the possible. The mechanism relies heavily on establishing emotional debt and cognitive reliance. They never instruct you to change. They simply anchor your deepest emotional states, your fears, your desire for belonging, your righteous indignation, to a specific set of beliefs or a predefined enemy. This is achieved by establishing a shared, highly potent vocabulary, loaded words that trigger immediate, visceral, internal reactions, and then subtly shifting the definition and application of those words over time, sometimes day by day. The central paradox of the influence mind is devastating. The harder you try to assert your independence within the framework they have established, the deeper you sink into their influence. Your resistance becomes proof of their narrative. Your struggle against their definitions validates the premise that you needed guidance in the first place. You are fighting the shadows on the wall, convinced you are battling the world without realizing the light source. The projector controlling your reality is located firmly in their hands. You fight the cage without ever seeing that the lock was placed on the inside. Look outward at the landscape of modern existence. Every highly specific algorithm, every targeted advertising campaign, every political or social echo chamber you inhabit is a customized labyrinth designed to narrow your attention. They are not trying to tell you what to think. They are far more sophisticated. They are telling you what to care about, what to fear, and what to hate. These potent emotional inputs are the primary control mechanisms in the digital age, generating a continuous loop of triggered responses that feel urgent, authentic, and utterly necessary. You are made to feel that participation in their designed reality is the only meaningful form of life. The highest price of sovereignty under influence is not just conforming behavior, it is the ultimate psychological impact, the erosion of self-reference. When you finally realize that your deepest held convictions, the ideas that motivate your entire life, might be meticulously engineered responses, you lose the ability to trust your own intuition. This is the zenith of psychological manipulation. When you successfully outsource your core judgment, you become a perfectly self-regulating automaton, requiring no external commands because the commands are now completely indistinguishable from your own authentic desires. The control is complete when you mistake their needs for your own purpose. The truest form of freedom is not having the right to choose, but having the fundamental right to define the universe of choices available. The ultimate psychological defense against the hijacked consciousness is mastering the map, not just navigating the path. Alarmism, governance through fear, the comfort of catastrophe and the exhaustion of alertness. Think back to the last time you felt truly secure, not complacent but stable, grounded in the belief that tomorrow, though uncertain, would not necessarily bring existential dread. Now, Contrast that moment of psychological stillness with your daily intake of information. Notice the subtle, persistent hum of impending disaster, the endless loop of imminent threat, environmental collapse, geopolitical fault lines, or viral resurgence. Why are we so consistently prepared for the worst, yet somehow always feel psychologically unprepared for peace? This is not accidental. Alarmism in this context is not the sincere, occasional warning of danger, it is the strategic management of fear itself. It's the institutionalization of crisis, where the state of emergency becomes the baseline reality. When you live under the constant shadow of the next big thing that threatens to collapse your stability, whether that threat is ecological, political, financial, or epidemiological, your cognitive resources shift entirely. You are psychologically diverted away from complex, long-term thinking and forced into immediate, reactive survival mode. Imagine a fire alarm placed in the center of your consciousness. Initially, that siren screams, demanding attention, forcing you to drop everything and locate the emergency exit. This is a natural, necessary response. But if that alarm goes off every hour, every day, relentlessly, eventually you stop listening to the sound. Your nervous system is saturated. You enter a state known as alert fatigue. The critical difference here is that in governance through fear, you don't merely tune out the noise. You learn to trust the panic button holder more than your own assessment of the smoke. You trade personal judgment for delegated anxiety relief. This manipulation works through a subtle yet powerfully effective psychological trade-off. Fear collapses the timeline. When you are terrified, when the perceived survival of the collective is at stake, you lose the capacity for nuanced questioning. You don't ask skeptical questions about long-term policy consequences, structural inefficiencies, or the inherent conflicts of interest held by the messengers. You only ask, "What do I do now?" This immediate demand for action shortens the democratic feedback loop and concentrates power. The message is simplified. Comply immediately, because complex debate is a luxury only available when the danger is past. When the house is burning, you don't debate the cost of the hose or the architectural competence of the fire chief. You simply grant the firefighter unconditional authority. And in a world of manufactured continuous crisis, the firefighter never leaves your living room. The perpetual presence of the state of emergency normalizes rapid, top-down decision-making and justifies the indefinite suspension of certain liberties, all in the name of your safety. Look at the architecture of modern media consumption, which is deeply interwoven with this structure. Every news cycle is designed not to inform you dispassionately, but to compel your attention through elevated threat levels. The headlines are weaponized, always catastrophic, always urgent, always demanding an emotional reaction. The intent is not necessarily malice, but the result is systemic exhaustion. If everything is critical, nothing truly is, but your nervous system disagrees vehemently. The constant state of cognitive vigilance is not accidental. It is a feature designed to burn out your resistance. Exhausted people seek simplicity, and simplicity often looks like authoritarian clarity, the definitive answer provided by the institutions managing the perpetual crisis. The ultimate casualty of governance through fear is not just your critical thinking, but your fundamental capacity for hope and constructive action. When catastrophe is the only official narrative offered, the future becomes a burden to be endured, not a project to be built. You stop being a proactive shaper of your reality and become a passive recipient of fate, only able to react to official instructions delivered under the banner of survival. This isn't just about political control, it is the deliberate atrophy of your personal agency, the silent agreement that you are too fragile, too incompetent, or too panicked to handle the truth outside of the official, crisis-driven narrative. The deepest manipulation is making you believe the world needs saving constantly, so you forget to ask if your own freedom, your ability to think calmly and autonomously, is the first thing being sacrificed in the rescue effort. The crisis may be real, but the perpetual alarm is the cage. Public humiliation, the theater of social sanction, the scaffolding of shame, public humiliation as social architecture. What is the one fear that transcends the fear of physical injury, the one pain we are biologically wired to avoid at all costs. It is not physical agony, it is exposure. It is the sudden, catastrophic realization that the safety net of social acceptance has dissolved beneath you, leaving you naked before the collective gaze. This is the foundation of public humiliation, and it is the single most effective and least discussed instrument of mass psychological control. Public humiliation is often framed in modern discourse as a natural consequence, a form of deserved punishment necessary to correct moral failings. But its true function is not correctional, it is fundamentally theatrical. It is a broadcast mechanism, a primitive social operating system designed not primarily to rehabilitate the individual, but to terrify the collective. It reminds every witness, every bystander, every passive observer precisely what the price of deviance is. We are talking about the deliberate theatrical removal of dignity in a public arena, specifically engineered to sever the individual from the protective body of the group. Consider the historical mechanisms of sanction. Think of the medieval pillory, or the stocks. The physical restraint imposed by the wood was restrictive, but the true torture was the gaze, the long, collective, hostile scrutiny. They weren't just punishing the body, they were breaking the spirit by dissolving the social contract. The crowd was not merely watching. They were actively participating in the execution of status. Today, the architecture has changed, but the fundamental power dynamic remains terrifyingly constant. The pillory is digital. It is the trending topic, the strategically cropped screenshot that goes viral, the comment section that morphs instantaneously into a modern stoning ground. The technology is faster, but the primary mechanism, the collective, sudden withdrawal of acceptance, is just as effective, if not more devastating. This leads us to the critical, uncomfortable question: why do we participate in the theater? Why are we so willing to throw stones, or at least watch them being thrown? Because witnessing public shame is psychologically intoxicating. It is a temporary, non-refundable boost to your own fragile social status. When someone else falls, especially someone you perceive as powerful or overly confident, you momentarily feel safer, higher up the ladder, more compliant, and therefore more secure within the group. This mechanism exploits the deepest paradox of human morality. We demand justice and accountability, but we secretly crave the spectacle of destruction. The manipulator understands this dual impulse perfectly. They know that shame is a far more powerful motivator than reward. The tension lies in the realization that when you participate in sanctioning someone else, you are simultaneously reinforcing the exact set of rigid, unforgiving social rules that could one day be utilized to destroy you. You are building the gallows upon which you might someday stand. Look at the modern environment. Public sanction has been weaponized, decentralized, and amplified instantaneously. It is often no longer about correcting a fundamental wrong, it's about signaling virtue. The narrative of outrage becomes a badge of belonging. The true psychological goal of any deep manipulation is to control internal behavior, not just external actions. The manipulator controls the masses by controlling the fear of shame. A few strategically placed, high-profile acts of public destruction are enough to keep millions compliant, paranoid, and perpetually self-censoring. You start editing your own thoughts, curating your own past, not because you fear the law, but because you fear the decentralized, anonymous, infinitely aggressive jury of your peers. The ultimate impact of living under the perpetual threat of public sanction is not just behavioral compliance, it's cognitive compliance. The pain of shame is so fundamentally profound that we begin to internalize the observing gaze. You no longer need an external warden. You begin to monitor your own actions, your own subtle internal monologues, everything you might dare to type or utter through the lens of potential public exposure and subsequent social execution. You become your own most ruthless warden. The consequence of this internalized surveillance is not just paralyzing fear, but a profound reduction in psychological freedom and authentic expression. This fear is the perfect solvent for independent thought, leaving behind only the residue of terrified conformity. Every audience member leaves the theater of social sanction profoundly changed, because you didn't just witness a downfall, you internalized the terrifying blueprint of your own possible destruction. And that blueprint, that silent, visceral fear of exposure, is the most enduring and effective tool of silent control ever invented. The divide and conquer strategy, the dissolution of alliances, the art of isolating the components, psychological divide and conquer. Think about the last time a trusted system, whether a close family unit, a partnership, or a professional team, suddenly fractured. That creeping sense of vulnerability, that sudden feeling of being exposed and alone when you thought you were buffered, that wasn't accidental. It's crucial to understand that manipulation often thrives not by direct brute force attack on you, but by strategically dismantling your protective architecture piece by piece while you are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and processing the day. The divide and conquer strategy, divide et impera, is ancient, but its psychological application is ruthlessly modern. Historically, it's about breaking a unified opposition into smaller, manageable, and often internally conflicted segments. Psychologically, it is the systematic dissolution of your core trust networks. It targets the shared reality that binds your alliances together. The relevance here is profound: a unified support system, friends who cross-reference facts, colleagues who agree on the context, partners who share a common vision, is the strongest defense against gaslighting or control. If a manipulator can systematically isolate your sources of independent validation, your own sanity, your own perception of reality becomes immediately negotiable. They don't need to control you. They just need to ensure nobody else can validate your experience accurately. Imagine a tightly knit trio of individuals who rely on each other for emotional honesty and truth. A psychological orchestrator doesn't try to win over all three simultaneously. They might begin by subtly whispering a slightly negative narrative about person A to person B, and then a completely contradictory, undermining narrative about person B to person C. They don't need to rely on overt lies. They only need to introduce microscopic, persistent doubt regarding the intent of each party. Person B starts thinking, "Why has person A been so distant and cold lately?" Person C begins to suspect B is competitive or perhaps secretly resentful. They stop cross-referencing notes on the strange behavior they've observed. The unity isn't broken by a visible conflict. It is dissolved by manufactured friction, by the slow drip of distrust, making the manipulator the seemingly necessary intermediary or confidant for each isolated individual. The devastating paradox of this strategy is that the moment you feel most threatened and alone, the moment your alliances fail you, you instinctively seek certainty. You look for a secure anchor. And the manipulator, the very agent who caused the systemic isolation and manufactured doubt, is now perfectly positioned to offer that certainty. They become the single source of truth because your independent external validation systems are entirely offline. The internal conflict is intense, deep down, that your friends were fundamentally good and trustworthy. But the subtle, planted evidence of their supposed betrayal feels utterly real in your isolated mind. The tension rises as you feel forced to choose between the shaky, inconsistent narrative of your now fractured alliance and the seemingly solid, albeit biased, narrative offered by the one person who appears to understand your confusion. This mechanism works precisely because we, as humans, prefer even an imperfect negative explanation for a disaster over the terrifying chaos of raw uncertainty. You see this dynamic constantly in modern emotional life. It's the manager who strategically distributes filtered information to pit two functional departments against each other in a race for diminishing resources. It's the partner who subtly and consistently criticizes your friend's habits or loyalties until you feel awkward spending time with them, slowly shrinking your social world until they are the only safe, approved harbor left. In the wider, more abstract digital realm, it's the relentless algorithmic feed that isolates your political or social views from those of your broader community, convincing you that everyone else is wrong, dangerous, or simply not worth the effort of conversation. They isolate the self by validating the division and celebrating the retreat into solitude. The most profound psychological impact of the dissolution of alliances is the permanent loss of external reality testing. When your trusted alliances are intact, they function as an interlocking series of mirrors, reflecting an agreed-upon, stable truth. When that mirror shatters into 1,000 fragments, you are left holding those shards, uncertain which piece reflects the true image of the situation, the others, or even yourself. This forced internal self-doubt is the ultimate objective. Once you doubt the fundamental validity of your judgments about your friends or your colleagues, you are forced to doubt your judgments about the orchestrator. You become highly susceptible to control, not because you are inherently weak, but because the very external structure designed to confirm your strength has been systematically liquidated. The true target isn't the alliance itself. The target is your confidence in your own ability to perceive reality accurately. When the bonds holding the collective truth are severed, the resulting lonely individual becomes the easiest target imaginable. Watch not just for who attacks you directly, but for who quietly profits when your most trusted connections fade into silence, confusion, and mutual distrust. The space where your allies once stood is precisely where the manipulator sets up their silent, invisible throne. Exploitation of mirror neurons, strategic synchronization. The silent echo, strategic synchronization, and the subversion of the mirror self. How often do you feel deeply understood by someone who just met you? That sense of immediate rapport, that physical comfort when their breathing slows down to match yours. It feels like fate, like alignment. You think, finally, someone who speaks my frequency. But what if that immediate, comforting alignment isn't organic connection, but carefully engineered resonance, a practice technique designed to make your subconscious drop its guard? We must talk about the neurological wires that connect us, the most powerful and vulnerable points in your social architecture, mirror neurons. Discovered first in macaques, these remarkable cells are the fundamental physiological basis of human empathy, learning, and cultural transmission. They are the reason you involuntarily stretch your legs when the person across from you stretches theirs. They are why you yawn when someone else yawns. They make you wince when you see pain inflicted on others. They are the physiological engine of imitation, creating a powerful, instantaneous, and entirely subconscious bridge between your nervous system and theirs. You are wired to mirror the world, and this instinct is constantly, strategically exploited. Imagine a skilled negotiator, perhaps a charismatic leader, or even a deeply manipulative, intimate partner. They enter the room, and rather than immediately dictating the pace, they pace you. They make no sudden moves. They are running a continuous, high-resolution diagnostic on your internal state, expressed externally. If you settle back in your chair, they settle back subtly a moment later. If your voice drops into a contemplative lower register, theirs follows. They are mirroring your posture, your rhythm, your vocal texture, perhaps even the rate of your blinks. They are absorbing your external reality and reflecting it back to you, often in dimensions you are not consciously tracking. This initial stage is pacing, validating your entire existence by literally echoing it back to you. The exploitation begins the moment this synchronicity is established. Once your subconscious registers their movements and rhythms as safe, as an extension, an echo of yourself, the gate of skepticism swings open. You are physiologically convinced that this person is like you, which is the fastest route to trust. The manipulator achieves strategic synchronization. They have built an invisible neurological tether, tying their output directly to your acceptance mechanism. This alignment provides a window of profound influence. Now comes the crucial shift, the leading. They begin to introduce new behaviors that subtly diverge from your original rhythm. They might straighten their posture slightly, signaling confidence or resolution. They might gently increase their vocal volume, signaling importance. They may make a small, focused movement toward the agreed-upon contract or the desired emotional state, because the mirror system has been trained to register them as the aligned other. Your own motor cortex primes itself to follow that lead. Your body attempts to match their new rhythm, believing the new rhythm is your own initiative, an organic desire to move forward or move closer. The internal conflict that normally accompanies change or high-stakes agreements is silence because the external source of the suggestion has become indistinguishable from an internal, self-generated impulse. You feel like you came up with the idea, or that the agreement was your organic evolution, when in fact, you were expertly guided into that space through imitation and strategic mirroring. In modern life, this shows up constantly. Think about the carefully choreographed, active listening techniques taught in high-stakes sales training or therapeutic settings where boundaries are blurred. It is not just about hearing your words, it is about echoing your specific gestures, your breathing patterns, and your physical leaning to dissolve resistance. It is the sophisticated influencer who adopts your specific vernacular and emotional cadence before subtly sliding in the call to action, or the political strategist who mirrors the fatigue and disillusionment of the crowd before offering their simplistic solution. They aren't trying to truly understand you, they are trying to become a temporary, trustworthy extension of your own psychology so they can seamlessly navigate your decisions. The psychological cost of being subject to this mechanism is the erosion of authentic connection. When you realize the deep rapport you felt, the effortless intimacy, was merely a practiced mimicry designed specifically to lower your defense mechanisms, you confront a profound sense of loneliness. You realize that true vulnerability requires genuine risk, while strategic synchronization offers only the illusion of safety, creating a temporary self-soothing feedback loop that terminates precisely when the transaction is complete. Be wary of those who understand you too quickly, or those with whom rapport is immediate and unnerving. For sometimes the perfect echo is not a sign of soul alignment, but the calculated prelude to moving you exactly where they need you to be without ever having to ask permission. 3. Exploitation of emotional contagion, influence through atmosphere. Have you ever entered a room where the argument had just ended, or where the silent tension was so thick it felt like a physical pressure against your chest? That sensation is not simply intuition. It is the raw, inescapable mechanism of emotional contagion. You didn't hear the fight, but your body felt the emotional fallout. You didn't read the script, but you instantaneously absorbed the atmosphere. This is the stage upon which the most subtle influence operates, the exploitation of emotional contagion through the engineering of atmosphere, the architecture of shared feeling, leveraged for precognitive consent. Emotional contagion is the rapid, unconscious mirroring and adoption of another person's emotional state, bypassing the need for verbal exchange. Your nervous system is constantly scanning the environment, seeking to synchronize its rhythm with the strongest emotional pulse in the room. We mimic subtle facial expressions, adopt postural tensions, and our brain chemistry aligns itself with the dominant frequency of the collective. This process is primal. It stems from our evolutionary need to belong and to assess collective threat instantly. If the tribe is panicking, your system needs to panic too, regardless of whether you personally saw the lion. It is a necessary inefficiency of the human collective, yet it is also the perfect backdoor for manipulation. To understand this exploitation, we must move beyond simple persuasion. Persuasion targets your logic. Emotional contagion targets your state of being. Imagine a concert hall, not during the music, but just before. A collective anticipation, a low-frequency hum, builds. If one person starts coughing, others clear their throats. If one person laughs loudly, the feeling of ease spreads. The manipulator, however, does not wait for this natural spread. They are the initial precise tuning fork struck just behind the curtain, setting the desired vibration that the entire auditorium must adopt. The exploitation begins when the atmosphere is deliberately engineered to foster a necessary emotion that validates the manipulator's agenda, regardless of the facts. The goal isn't to convince you of an idea, but to generate the feeling required for that idea to be instantly accepted as self-evident truth. If they need aggressive loyalty, they saturate the environment with manufactured outrage against an external threat. If they need unquestioning compliance, they infuse the space with hurried urgency and low-grade anxiety, a palpable pressure that demands immediate conformity. You believe you are reacting to objective reality, the importance of the mission, the severity of the threat, but you are merely tuning into the predetermined, emotionally charged frequency established before you even walked in. This technique sidesteps your critical faculties entirely. Logic requires time, attention, and effort. Emotion is instant and effortless. If the collective atmosphere reads emergency, your internal resources shift to survival mode, abandoning the nuanced calculation required for critical thought. The paradox is that the more intensely you feel the required emotion, whether fear, euphoria, or righteous indignation, the less you examine the source of that emotion. You mistake the volume of the shared feeling for the veracity of the claim. In the rush of collective anxiety, the solution offered by the conductor of the orchestra seems not just viable but desperately necessary. Look at the modern political rally, the corporate emergency meeting designed to push through a poorly vetted project, or even the strategically cluttered high-pressure retail environment where music and lighting combine to create artificial scarcity and haste. These are carefully calibrated echo chambers designed to leverage your inherent need for synchronization. Online, this architecture is even stealthier, the curated feed designed to generate mild fear of missing out, FOMO, and low-level stress, keeping your emotional defenses slightly lowered, making you susceptible to the next urgent, emotionally loaded call to action or purchase. The digital interface is not just showing you content, it is delivering an ambient, contagious feeling of inadequacy or frenzy. The profound psychological cost of living under these engineered atmospheres is the slow, continuous loss of sovereignty over your own emotional reactions. You begin to mistake the collective anxiety for your personal intuition. You conflate shared enthusiasm with genuine internal conviction. When you are constantly operating in a state borrowed from the environment, whether it is manufactured urgency or residual fear, your internal emotional compass deteriorates. The loudest feeling in the room becomes the only truth. Your deepest self is constantly being drowned out by the ambient noise strategically placed to control your response. The consequence is that you participate in actions you might rationally condemn simply because the feeling of collective movement made it impossible to stay still. The ultimate freedom is not just choosing what you think, but choosing what you feel. Learn to distinguish between the heat of the atmosphere and the steady temperature of your own center, for until you can isolate your genuine heartbeat from the engineered rhythm of the crowd, you are merely an instrument vibrating to someone else's tune. Or the halo effect, judgment by radiance. You are constantly making deep judgments about complex beings, yet your brain seeks the simplest possible evidence to finish the calculation. This is the moment you confront the bias that dictates who you trust, who you hire, and who you fall in love with. This is the surrender to projected excellence. This is the halo effect. You walk into a room, a meeting, or a social feed and instantly categorize someone. They look successful, therefore they must be intelligent. They are attractive, therefore they must be kind and trustworthy. They speak with unshakable confidence, therefore they must know the absolute truth. Why does a single shining attribute possess the power to blind you to everything else? Can you ever truly see past the initial glow? Or is the decision already final? The halo effect, coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike nearly a century ago, is the cognitive error where the initial positive assessment of one prominent trait, whether it is physical beauty, perceived status, or articulate speech, is allowed to radically spill over and influence your entire evaluation of that person's unrelated qualities. It is not admiration, it is radical extrapolation based on a single, high-wattage aesthetic input. Your mind is operating under the assumption that good things cluster together. If they possess one excellent attribute, they must possess them all. Imagine the mind as a vast, darkened gallery dedicated to the complex assessment of human character. When one specific figure is placed under a harsh, beautiful spotlight, the resulting intense radiance washes out the shadows. You no longer see the entirety of the sculpture. You don't see the cracks in the marble, the unfinished surface, or the unstable pedestal it rests upon. You only see the source of the radiance. You are not judging the substance, you are judging the light it casts. Why does the sophisticated machinery of your perception engage in such profound laziness? Because evaluation is mentally expensive. Truly assessing whether someone is honest, competent, and reliable requires time, data, and the deployment of substantial mental resources. The halo effect is an efficiency shortcut. We replace the labor of critical assessment with the immediate, visceral pleasure of superficial appreciation. It's easier to assume the beautiful person is also the smartest person than it is to wait and test their intellectual capacity. This bias is immediately weaponized by anyone seeking influence. The ultimate paradox of the halo effect is this: the attributes we claim to value most, integrity, strategic intelligence, emotional depth, are precisely the ones most easily inferred and therefore manipulated by the cheapest inputs available. Practice charm, expensive presentation, and unwavering, sometimes baseless, confidence. The more radiant the exterior someone strategically projects, the less inclined you are to engage in the tedious, suspicious work of searching for darkness underneath. Look at the modern sphere of influence. Every brand ambassador, every political figure, every successful consultant is built entirely upon a strategic halo. They present a singular, overwhelming positive trait: affluence, vulnerability, rugged health, hoping that this concentrated brightness will bleed into every other evaluation. They engineer authority based purely on projected light, trusting that you will assume competence based on curation and reliability based on visual appeal. The product, the policy, or the personality behind the glow becomes secondary to the glow itself. You are buying the light, not the object it illuminates. To realize that you have been judging strategic competency based on aesthetic charm is to confront a primal failure of self-awareness. It means your crucial decisions in hiring and romance, in financial investment, may have been based on the sharpness of a jawline or the practiced tone of a voice, rather than verifiable data. This realization changes everything, forcing you to question the foundation of your trust. But there is a cold clarity in this awareness. Understanding the halo effect means understanding the exact levers of perception. You realize that you too can craft your own radiance, strategically curating the single attribute you want the world to use to define your entire character. The power lies not just in seeing the light, but in deciding where the spotlight falls. The truly manipulative do not hide their flaws. They simply ensure their strongest attribute shines so blindingly that those flaws become invisible shadows. The most dangerous people are not those hiding in the dark. They are those who understand precisely how to control the direction and intensity of the light. Be careful what you let shine brightest, because the shadow it casts is usually where the truth lives. 5. The power of playing the fool, strategic incompetence. You spend your entire life trying to prove competence, climbing the jagged pyramid of performance, relentlessly striving to show the world that you are capable, efficient, and essential. But what if the greatest strategic move isn't competence, but the calculated surrender of it? What if the path to true strength, control, and freedom lies in being strategically underestimated? We are talking about the delicate dance of strategic incompetence, or as we call it in the shadows of human strategy, the power of playing the fool. This is not genuine inability. It is a meticulously crafted, temporary performance of ignorance, clumsiness, or simple forgetfulness. It is the art of deliberately setting the bar lower for yourself, ensuring that external expectations become so minimal that your eventual success, or more importantly, your total avoidance of undesirable tasks, becomes effortless and expected. Think of the historical court jester. He was allowed freedoms and insights denied to the highest-ranking nobles. Why? Because he owned his perceived foolishness. He was exempt from the lethal pressures of dignity and expectation. He was the only person in the entire court who was truly free to observe, to speak the uncomfortable truth, and to ultimately survive. Consider the dynamics in any high-stakes environment. There is always the go-to person, the high performer who fixes everyone's messes, who always steps up to take on the complex project, the person who burns their weekends covering the incompetence of others. This person is respected, yes, but they are perpetually overworked, drowning in the sheer weight of their proven capability. Then there is the other type, the individual who always slightly misunderstands the new software, the one who requires 3 prompts to handle a minor bureaucratic task or who consistently makes a small, predictable error early in the process that necessitates a correction by someone else. The first person is respected, the second is protected. The fool is never asked to clean the dishes after the banquet. The mechanism works on 2 powerful psychological forces, social inertia and the principle of least effort. People, especially those in positions of authority or those who are themselves overwhelmed, will always gravitate toward the path of least resistance. If assigning a task to you costs them more mental energy because they anticipate monitoring, fixing, repeating instructions, or soothing your inevitable crisis, than doing the task themselves or assigning it to the go-to person, they stop assigning it to you. You are trading a small, manageable amount of social friction, being perceived as a little dull or unreliable, for a massive, permanent reduction in your workload and cognitive burden. Crucially, the performance of the fool grants you profound strategic advantages. While everyone else is busy carrying the load, proving their worth, and worrying about maintaining their flawless facade, the strategically incompetent person is free. They are free to observe unimpeded. They are often dismissed as background noise, allowing them to gather vital information about the system's flaws, the manager's weaknesses, and the hidden motives of the truly capable players. The competent person is too busy carrying the weight to look up and see the trap. The fool stands back, watching the tension snap. In modern life, this manifests most dangerously in intimate and emotional relationships, what is often termed weaponized helplessness. One partner cannot manage the household finances, cannot handle the difficult confrontation with the landlord, or cannot remember complex scheduling. This is a subtle yet brutal form of manipulation. It frees the feigning partner from emotional and cognitive burden, shifting the entirety of the practical and psychological labor onto the other. It is not always malice. Sometimes it is simply the subconscious avoidance of friction. We see it online too, the performative humility. The social media confession of inadequacy designed specifically to solicit validation, guidance, or attention from a targeted audience. The psychological impact of strategic incompetence on the practitioner is immense control, provided they maintain acute awareness of the performance. You must internalize that the incompetence is merely a mask, a calculated delay, a strategic shield. By reducing external expectations to 0, you have maximum flexibility. When you do choose to succeed, it's not viewed as required competence, it's seen as miraculous brilliance, a moment of unexpected genius born from simple good fortune. You control the reveal. You dictate the narrative of your own capacity. The moment you perform brilliantly, the past incompetence is dismissed as a fluke, and your baseline of future expectation remains comfortably low. The wise man parades his knowledge for immediate admiration. The cunning man hides his true power for strategic leverage. The true genius isn't the one who knows everything, but the one who convinces everyone that he knows just enough to be harmless. The fool is the only character on the stage who gets to truly choose his role, and he gets the last laugh because he was never holding the bag in the first place. Not many reach the end awake. Leave a single word that defines this journey and share it with someone who might need to hear it tonight.